The police scanner crackled to life at 10:30 on the night of October 22, 1989. The man sitting in the quiet of his living room in rural Minnesota turned up the volume. He listened to the overlapping voices of law enforcement officers. He listened to dispatchers calling for backup. He listened to the sound of the largest search in the history of the state being assembled in real time. They were mobilizing the National Guard. They were sending helicopters with thermal imaging over the forests. They were flooding the dirt roads with flashlights and tracking dogs and thousands of volunteers who had left their homes in the dark because an 11-year-old boy was missing. The man with the scanner knew exactly why they would never find him. He had buried the boy in an isolated gravel pit 30 miles away and driven home to listen to the search. What happened in the hours that followed, and in the 27 years after, was not simply a story about a missing child. It was a story about a system that held the killer in its hands, collected his DNA, and opened the door. And it would take not a federal profiler, not a cold case task force, but a local writer sitting alone at a microfilm machine to finally see what had been sitting in the archive the entire time. But before any of that, we have to go back to the evening of October 22nd. Because to understand what was lost on that dark stretch of road in St. Joseph, Minnesota, you first have to understand who Jacob Wetterling was. St. Joseph, in the fall of 1989, was the kind of small Minnesota town where the front doors stayed unlocked and children biked the dirt roads long after the streetlights came on, because that was simply how things were done, and no one had been given a reason to think otherwise. The air that October held the particular crispness of a Midwest autumn, dry leaves, wood smoke from early season fires, the faint smell of turned earth from the fields outside of town. It was the kind of evening that made people feel safe without having to decide to. Jacob Wetterling was 11 years old. He was the eldest son of Jerry and Patty Wetterling, raised in a household that his mother would later describe in testimony before the United States Congress as defined by ordinary joy, the specific joy of children who feel certain the world will hold them. Jacob was the kind of boy who collected football cards with the seriousness of a curator, who told anyone who asked that he intended to be a professional football player when he grew up, who could list his favorite color, his favorite game, and his best friend without hesitation, because these were the coordinates of a life that felt solid and his. He had a younger brother, Trevor, who was 10. He had a mother who would within the year change the laws of the United States of America, but none of that had happened yet. On the evening of October 22nd, Patty and Jerry were hosting friends at the house. Jacob asked for a simple, completely ordinary piece of permission. He wanted to ride his bike to the Tom Thumb convenience store in town with Trevor and Aaron to rent a video. He had done it before. The store was close. The night was clear. The three boys set out. The ride to the store was routine. They chose their movie, paid the clerk, and began the ride back home. It was just after 9 in the evening. The route took them down an unlit stretch of road, deep drainage ditches on either side, thick stands of trees pressing in from the darkness. The only sound was the crunch of bicycle tires on gravel. And then a shadow moved. A figure stepped out from a driveway ahead of them. He was dressed entirely in dark clothing. A stocking cap was pulled down over his face. In his hand, a revolver. The boys had no way of knowing the weapon was unloaded. The threat was absolute. The man ordered them to stop, to throw their bikes into the ditch, to lie face down in the dirt. They complied. He stood over them in the darkness. He asked each boy one specific question, their ages. 10, 11, 11. He looked at 10-year-old Trevor. Stand up. Run into the woods. Do not look back. The command was explicit. If Trevor turned around, he would be shot. The boy scrambled to his feet and ran into the dark trees. The man leaned down over the two remaining boys and examined their faces in the low light. A brief, calculated assessment. He picked Jacob. He ordered Aaron to do the same. Run, do not look back. Aaron obeyed. He sprinted into the tree line and found Trevor. Jacob Wetterling remained behind on the dirt road with the masked man. When local authorities arrived and swept their red and blue lights into the trees, they found only the bicycles in the ditch. Jacob was gone. The response was immediate and massive in a way that the region had never seen. Local police, the FBI, the National Guard. Helicopters with thermal imaging moved over the forests. Tracking dogs worked the ditches and the brush. Thousands of volunteers, neighbors, teachers, business owners walked shoulder to shoulder through miles of dense fields and wetland. The community mobilized with an urgency that came from one shared belief. Jacob was still out there somewhere, still close, and there was still time. But the landscape gave them nothing. No discarded clothing, no struggle site beyond the bikes, no sign of the boy. In December of 1989, less than 2 months after the abduction, investigators encountered a man named Danny James Heinrich. He was local. Unassuming, he lived in close proximity to the site of the crime, and his physical build matched the profile. On December 16th, the FBI brought him into a room and questioned him. They collected a DNA sample. They pressed him on his whereabouts the night of October 22nd. He did not confess. There was no direct witness placing him at the convenience store route. In 1989, DNA profiling was still in its earliest days. No rapid processing, no national databases. There were no grounds to hold him. The FBI made a decision. They released Danny Heinrich. He walked out of the interrogation room, returned to his car, and drove back to his life. He would not be charged with anything connected to Jacob Wetterling for 27 more years. What allowed this to happen was not bad luck. It was a failure of communication so complete that it is difficult, even now, to account for. Between 1986 and 1987, a cluster of assaults on young boys had occurred in the Paynesville area, a rural community 40 minutes from St. Joseph. 5 teenage boys targeted, chased, and attacked by a single male perpetrator. The pattern of behavior was unmistakable. No arrests were ever made. The Paynesville incidents were filed in local police records and never connected to anything beyond themselves. Then, in January of 1989, 9 months before Jacob disappeared, a 12-year-old boy named Jared Shy was abducted in Cold Spring, Minnesota, 10 miles from where Jacob would later be taken. The attacker used a gun to gain compliance. He wore a mask, and when he released his victim, he gave a specific command: run away, do not look back. The gun, the mask, the command. Geographic proximity. Behavioral signatures, identical, and yet investigators in December of 1989, with Danny Heinrich sitting across a table from them, did not connect the Cold Spring assault or the Paynesville attacks to the Wetterling abduction. The man responsible for all of it walked out the door. As the years passed, the statute of limitations expired on the Jared Shy case. Even if someone later proved definitively who had attacked that boy, they would be legally barred from bringing charges. The system stalled. The files gathered dust. Danny Heinrich was living free. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, going through records, tracking documents that weren't meant to surface, verifying the details that closed cold cases. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Drop us a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read every one. Now let's get back to Jacob. It was not a senior FBI profiler who finally saw the pattern. It was not a dedicated cold case detective assigned to the file. It was a local writer named Joy Baker. In 2014, 25 years after Jacob disappeared, Baker was independently researching the regional history of central Minnesota. She spent hours at a microfilm machine, scrolling through archived police logs, reading through records that no one else had thought to cross-reference in a very long time. She began to notice the cluster of crimes in Paynesville. She read the reports of the 5 boys targeted and attacked, no arrests, treated as a closed local matter. She kept digging chronologically forward through the archives. She found the Cold Spring assault. January 1989. 12-year-old Jared Shy, 10 miles from where Jacob would later be taken. Baker cross-referenced the Cold Spring police reports with the facts of the Wetterling case. The overlap was precise and undeniable. The gun, the mask, the explicit command, "Run away, do not look back." She reached out to the surviving victims of the Paynesville attacks. She documented their accounts. She compiled the behavioral patterns of the attacker into a coherent documented argument. Then, she walked into a police precinct with a stack of organized historical research she had built on her own time, on a microfilm machine, in the middle of the day, and she demanded that investigators look at what had been sitting in their own archives for 25 years. This civilian intervention directly triggered the forensic pivot that broke the case. In 2015, advances in forensic technology allowed technicians to extract and analyze a complete DNA profile from the clothing of Jared Shy, evidence that had been held in storage since the 1989 Cold Spring assault. Investigators ran the newly isolated profile against their databases. The result came back as an absolute match. The DNA belonged to Danny James Heinrich, the exact same man the FBI had brought into an interrogation room, collected a DNA sample from, and released in December of 1989. Less than 2 months after Jacob was taken. The DNA from the Shy case provided probable cause. Investigators secured a comprehensive search warrant for Heinrich's current residence in Annandale, Minnesota. They executed the warrant and found inside the home a large cache of child sexual abuse material. This provided the immediate legal mechanism to remove Heinrich from society. On October 28, 2015, 26 years after Jacob Wetterling disappeared from a gravel road in St. Joseph, Danny Heinrich was arrested on federal charges. They had the man. They still did not know where Jacob was buried. The resolution of this case required a decision that no family should ever be asked to accept, and the Wetterlings accepted it because the alternative was worse. Prosecutors recognized that taking Heinrich to trial solely on the federal material charges would likely secure a lengthy sentence. But it would mean the Wetterling family would never know what had happened to their son. Jacob's remains would never come home. To secure the truth, they brokered a plea agreement under rigid, controversial terms, in exchange for leading authorities to Jacob's remains and confessing in full and open court. State prosecutors would not file murder charges against Heinrich. He would plead guilty to a single federal charge. The Wetterlings said yes, because they needed to bring their boy home. On Thursday, September 1, 2016, under heavy guard, Danny Heinrich led investigators to a rural pasture near Paynesville, approximately 30 miles from the spot in St. Joseph where he had taken Jacob 27 years earlier. Excavation teams carefully worked the earth, buried deep in the pasture. They recovered human remains and fragments of clothing. 2 days later, on September 3, 2016, Forensic dental records provided the final definitive confirmation. The remains belonged to Jacob Irwin Wetterling. The search that had mobilized the National Guard, engaged thousands of citizens across 2 decades, and defined a family's entire public life, ended quietly in a dirt field outside Paynesville. On September 6, 2016, in a federal courtroom, Danny Heinrich took the stand and confessed. Under oath, in clinical and unsparing detail, he confirmed everything. He was the masked man who stepped out of the driveway on October 22, 1989. He had ordered Aaron Larson and Trevor Wetterling to run into the woods. He had placed handcuffs on Jacob, forced him into his vehicle, and driven away from St. Joseph. He had taken Jacob to the gravel pit near Paynesville. After the assault, he had executed the 11-year-old boy with a single gunshot and buried him in the immediate area. Then he had driven home and spent the rest of the night listening to his police scanner, sitting in his living room, monitoring the desperate search for a child who was already dead. He also admitted that approximately 1 year after the murder, he had returned to the gravel pit and found that a portion of Jacob's red jacket had become exposed to the surface. To prevent discovery, he had dug up the remains and relocated them to the pasture, where they would sit undisturbed for 26 more years. On November 21, 2016, Danny Heinrich was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Before handing down the sentence, United States District Judge John Tunheim addressed the courtroom and looked directly at the defendant. He said, "Every child knows the story of Jacob Wetterling. You stole the innocence of children in small towns, in the cities of Minnesota, and beyond." The legal proceedings closed an active case. They could not close what Jacob Wetterling's disappearance had already set in motion. Because long before the arrest, long before Joy Baker's microfilm research, long before Danny Heinrich ever sat in a courtroom, Patty Wetterling had decided that her grief was going to be a weapon. Just 4 months after Jacob was taken, Jerry and Patty Wetterling established the Jacob Wetterling Foundation. Their initial goal was to find their son and support other families facing a missing child. But as Patty engaged with law enforcement protocols across the country, she identified a structural flaw embedded in the American legal framework. There was no centralized system for tracking individuals convicted of severe crimes against children once they were released back into society. Police departments in neighboring jurisdictions rarely shared information about local offenders. Citizens had no way of knowing if a convicted predator lived near a school or a playground. In a case like Jacob's, where Danny Heinrich had a documented history of assaults on young boys in the same geographic region, where police departments had the information and simply had not spoken to one another, that gap had cost a child his life. Patty Wetterling traveled to Washington. She testified before congressional committees. She met with lawmakers. She made the problem undeniable. In 1994, the United States Congress passed the Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children and Sexually Violent Offender Registration Act. For the first time in American history, federal law mandated that individual states must create and maintain registries of convicted sex offenders. The Wetterling Act required offenders to verify their addresses with local law enforcement for a minimum of 10 years after release, lifetime registration for the most severe. In 1996, Megan's Law expanded these requirements, mandating public notification protocols and allowing citizens to search the registry by zip code. In 2006, the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act created a national standard for registration and categorization. Every one of these laws traces its origin directly to the testimony and advocacy of a mother from St. Joseph, Minnesota, who refused to let her son's name mean only loss. There is no way to fully account for what this legislation prevented. The law cannot be seen doing what it stops. But the framework Patty Wetterling built, born from a night in 1989 when a boy went to rent a video and didn't come home, now governs how this country tracks the people most likely to harm children. That is what she made of the worst thing that ever happened to her. Jacob Wetterling would have been 37 years old in 2016, the year the truth came out. He had been saving football cards. He wanted to be a wide receiver. His favorite color was blue. His best friend was Aaron Larson, the boy who ran into the woods that night and carried the weight of that night for the rest of his life, as survivors do. Jacob had a whole future ahead of him on the evening of October 22nd, 1989, and it was stolen from him on a dark gravel road by a man who then drove home and turned on a scanner to listen to people look for him. There is something particular about this case that the 27-year gap makes visible. Danny Heinrich did not hide in another state. He did not flee the country or change his name or build a different life in a different place. He stayed in central Minnesota. He went to work. He paid his bills. He existed inside the same geography as the family whose lives he had destroyed, in the same communities, under the same name. The only thing that protected him for 27 years was the silence between filing cabinets. The fact that a police report in Paynesville never made it to a desk in St. Joseph. The fact that a DNA sample taken in December of 1989 sat in an archive while technology that could match it didn't yet exist, and then did exist, and then existed for years before anyone ran the test. It took a writer with a library card and a microfilm machine to assemble what the system had possessed the entire time. This case raises questions that stay with you. The plea agreement that brought Jacob home meant Danny Heinrich would not face murder charges. He received a 20-year federal sentence for a single count of receiving child pornography. Was that justice, or the shape of justice? What does it mean that Joy Baker, not a detective, not a federal agent, but a local writer doing her own research, is the person who finally forced authorities to look at what they already had? And what should we make of the fact that the law bearing Jacob's name is now one of the most significant child safety frameworks in American history, built by his mother, in the years she spent not knowing where he was? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Everyone is read, and the conversations this community creates are part of why this work continues. Jacob Wetterling was found. The truth of what happened to him on October 22, 1989, is now permanently part of the public record. The laws written in his name continue to operate every day, in every state, protecting children whose names will never appear on a headline because Danny Heinrich's name is on a registry and a door doesn't open. That is his legacy. That is what his family made of an unthinkable thing. Stories like this one are why this channel exists. If you believe the truth is worth pursuing, no matter how long it takes, subscribe. There are more cases waiting. Thank you for being here.